Today on the show, we're diving into the world of economic indicators. These are the numbers that tell us how the economy is doing. Things like GDP, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence. But what do these indicators really mean? How are they calculated? And how should we interpret them? We'll break it all down for you with the help of some experts to make sense of the numbers that shape our world. The scent of garlic and rosemary clung to the warm air in the kitchen, a welcome ghost of the dinner they had shared. From his place on the sofa, Leo watched Anya as she moved, her back to him. The soft glow of the under-cabinet lights traced the elegant line of her spine, the gentle curve of her shoulder, as she methodically dried a wine glass. There was a quiet, deliberate grace to everything she did, a kind of placid certainty that Leo, a man whose mind was a perpetual tempest of blueprints and anxieties, found profoundly calming. He was an architect. His world was one of rigid lines, calculated stresses, and the unforgiving laws of physics. He built structures designed to withstand the unseen forces of the world. But in his own life, he had never managed to build a foundation so solid. There was always a tremor of anxiety, a hairline fracture of doubt, until Anya, in 3 months, she had renovated the interior of his life. She didn't change him, not really. Instead, she seemed to locate the load-bearing walls of his personality and reinforce them. His self-doubt became thoughtful introspection. His obsessive nature became an eye for detail. She was the calm at the center of his storm, and the silence she brought was the most beautiful sound he had ever known. "You're staring," she said, her voice a low murmur that carried easily across the open-plan living space. She didn't turn around, but he could hear the smile in her words. "I'm admiring the view," he replied, and it was the truth. He took in the scene. The soft lamplight on the dark wood floors, the stack of art books on the coffee table, the way her deep red sweater seemed to drink the light. It was a picture of domestic peace, a life he'd only ever drafted in his imagination. It felt unreal, fragile, as if a strong wind could blow it all away. He pushed the thought aside. It was the old Leo trying to reassert himself, the one who looked for the stress points in every happy moment. He had a long history with the darker corners of his own mind. For years, sleep had not been a refuge for him, but a hunting ground. Sleep paralysis. The diagnosis was clinical, detached. It did nothing to describe the reality of it. The sudden, suffocating wakefulness in a body turned to stone. The crushing weight on your chest. The desperate, silent scream locked behind a paralyzed jaw. And worst of all, the certainty, the absolute primal knowledge that you were not alone. His visitor was always the same. He called it the gaunt figure. It was a creature of impossible height and terrifying thinness, a splinter of darkness given human form. It would stand in the corner of his room or at the foot of his bed, its presence a physical weight that made the very air feel thick and heavy. It had no face, only a suggestion of a head, a place where the shadows were deeper, absolute. It never moved, never touched him, just watched. The terror it inspired was a pure, undiluted thing, an instinctual horror that bypassed reason. But the creature had been absent for 3 months, exactly 94 days. Leo had been counting. Since his first date with Anya, he had slept like a stone, sinking into a peaceful, dreamless void and waking up feeling refreshed, reborn. He had convinced himself she was the cure, that her calming presence had somehow fortified his mind and banished the old phantom. The gaunt figure was a symptom of his loneliness, and he wasn't lonely anymore. "Come to bed," Anya said, finally turning. She placed the dry glass in the cupboard with a soft click. The light caught in her dark hair, creating a halo effect that made Leo's chest ache with affection. "You have that early meeting tomorrow." He nodded, pushing himself off the sofa. "Only if you're coming with me." "Wouldn't dream of being anywhere else," she smiled, and the smile was perfect. Everything about her was perfect. Later, lying in the dark, Leo felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Anya was a warm, breathing presence beside him, her scent a mix of lavender and something uniquely her own, something clean and earthy, like fresh soil after a rain. Her breathing was a soft, rhythmic tide, pulling him gently towards the shores of sleep. He felt safe, protected. His last conscious thought was a simple, happy one. This is what it feels like to be home. The transition was jarring, violent, There was no slow drift into the nightmare. One moment, he was in the peaceful black of deep sleep. The next, his eyes were open, staring at the familiar silhouette of their bedroom ceiling. But it wasn't a true waking. It was the other thing. The prison. The weight was the first sign. A lead blanket on his limbs, an anchor in his lungs. He tried to draw a breath and could only manage a shallow, panicked flutter. He tried to turn his head to look at Anya, to assure himself she was there, but his neck was a column of granite. Only his eyes could move, darting back and forth in their sockets, cataloging the room in a frantic search. The window, the dresser, the half-open closet door, the corner. His blood went cold. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was an ancient cellular cold. He knew before he even looked what he would find. The silence in the room was different now. It was a hungry, listening silence. The air itself felt brittle, stretched thin. Slowly, fighting an invisible current, he dragged his gaze to the corner of the room, near the window where the moonlight spilled onto the floor. It was there. The gaunt figure stood, taller than he remembered, its form seeming to warp the very shadows around it. It was as if it wasn't just standing in the darkness, but was woven from it. A place where the night had congealed into a man-shaped stain. It was impossibly thin, its limbs like stretched ligaments, its torso a collapsed hollow cage. It seemed to absorb the light, the sound, the very warmth from the room. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. A scream built in his throat, a raw, desperate sound of pure terror. But it was born and died in silence, strangled by his useless muscles. After 3 months of peace, of blissful, dreamless nights, the monster was back. And this time it felt different. It felt worse, more present, more real. It stood there, a silent sentinel of dread, and its faceless head was angled directly at him, a predator that had finally rediscovered its prey. The first night was a relapse. The second was a terrifying coincidence. By the 5th consecutive night, it was a pattern, a brutal, soul-crushing siege. Sleep was no longer a reprieve, but an ambush waiting to be sprung. The days bled into one another, hazy and indistinct, framed by the stark, crystalline terror of the nights. At work, the elegant precision required of him became an impossible task. Lines on his blueprint seemed to swim, the sharp angles of a roofline softening into indistinct blurs. He'd find himself staring at a screen, a half-finished 3D model of a sterile, minimalist home, and the clean, empty rooms would feel menacing, full of dark corners where shadows could pool and deepen. His coffee intake tripled, but the caffeine did little to pierce the thick fog of fatigue. It only served to fray his nerves, leaving him with a persistent low-grade tremor in his hands. Another rough night, my love. Anya's voice would be the first thing he'd hear in the morning, a silken thread of concern stitching the frayed edges of his consciousness back together. She would be there when he finally emerged from the paralysis, her hand stroking his hair, her eyes wide with a deep, convincing sympathy. She was relentless in her support. She bought him chamomile tea, which he drank dutifully. She insisted on a no-screens rule for an hour before bed, during which she'd read to him from a book of poetry, her voice a soothing melody. She researched sleep clinics, sending him links with gentle subject lines like, "Maybe this could help." Her presence was a constant, warm reassurance that what he was experiencing was a medical condition, a misfiring of his own brain chemistry, and not a visitation. "It's just a waking dream." "Leo," she'd say, her thumb tracing soft circles on his temple, "your body is asleep, but your mind is awake. It's terrifying, but it's not real." He's not real. He clung to her words like a drowning man to a raft. She was his anchor to the rational world. During the day, under the bright, unforgiving sun, he could almost believe her. He would look at her, so vibrant and full of life, her laughter echoing in their apartment, and the memory of the gaunt figure would seem ridiculous, a gothic fantasy cooked up by an exhausted mind. The problem was his, not hers. The monster was his, a phantom born from his own faulty wiring. But the nights kept coming. And on the 8th night, something changed. The paralysis seized him as usual, a sudden plunge into a cold, heavy sea. The weight bore down, the silence thickened, and his heart began its frantic, muffled drumbeat. He squeezed his eyes shut, a useless, childish defense. Don't look, don't look, don't look, and it won't be there. But it was always there. The feeling of its presence was absolute, a change in the very pressure of the room. He could feel it coalesce in the corner, a knot of absence in the fabric of reality. Against his will, his eyes snapped open and locked onto the shape. The gaunt figure stood in its usual place, a column of solidified dread. For a long moment, the familiar tableau held, the silent watcher and its petrified victim. Then, with a slowness that felt deeply unnatural, its featureless head began to turn. The movement was not smooth. It was stiff, horridly deliberate, like a time-lapsed film of a dead flower turning its face toward a dying sun. It turned away from him. Leo's mind screamed. This was new. This was a violation of the rules. The monster was supposed to watch him. That was the entire point. The figure's head stopped, its unseen gaze now fixed upon the other side of the bed, upon Anya. She was a still form under the duvet, her breathing deep and even, utterly oblivious to the nightmare standing mere feet from her. A wave of protective fury, impotent and useless, surged through Leo. Leave her alone. The thought was a desperate, silent roar. The entity remained motionless for a heart-stopping eternity, seemingly studying her. Then its head swiveled back to Leo. The terror redoubled. It was acknowledging her. It was making a connection. It was turning his private horror into a shared space. And then it did something else. Its right arm, a thing of impossible length and thinness, began to lift. It rose jerkily, like a broken marionette's limb being hoisted by a string. The joints, if it had them, seemed to click and pop in the suffocating silence. The arm extended, reaching out over the bed, not to touch but to single out. A long, needle-thin finger, more a sharpened point of shadow than a digit, trembled at the end of its hand. It pointed. The finger was aimed squarely at Anya, a quivering, definitive accusation in the dark. Leo stared, his mind struggling to process the gesture. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, freighted with intent. It was a communication. The figure held the pose, its arm outstretched, its finger an unwavering spear of darkness aimed at the sleeping woman beside him. The message was clear, even if the meaning was incomprehensible. Look at her. Just as suddenly as it began, the paralysis released its grip. With a convulsive gasp, Leo sucked in a lungful of air. His body shuddered violently, and he jackknifed into a sitting position, drenched in a cold, slick sweat. His eyes darted to the corner of the room. It was empty. The shadows were just shadows. He whipped his head to look at Anya. She stirred at his sudden movement, murmuring something in her sleep before settling back into a peaceful rhythm. She was unharmed. She was perfect. Leo sat there for hours, his back against the headboard, listening to the sound of her breathing. He tried to rationalize what he had seen. His anxiety was simply evolving, finding new narratives. Of course, his subconscious would incorporate Anya into the horror. She was the most important person in his life. The pointing finger wasn't a warning. It was a manifestation of his own deep-seated fear of losing her, of something tainting this perfect happiness. It was a convincing argument. It was a rational explanation. But as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, the image remained, burned onto the backs of his eyelids. A skeletal, trembling finger of pure shadow, pointing an unwavering accusation at the woman he loved. The pointing finger became a nightly ritual, a silent, damning indictment from a creature of shadow. Leo began to anticipate it, to dread it, and yet, in a strange way, to study it. The initial shock had given way to a morbid, fearful curiosity. He was a prisoner in his own body, forced to watch the same macabre pantomime repeat itself, night after night. But then, the performance began to change. It started about a week after the pointing began. The gaunt figure materialized, its form darker and more defined than ever. It turned its head towards Anya, then back to Leo. It raised its trembling finger and pointed, but this time it didn't hold the pose. Its other hand, a twisted claw of black smoke, rose slowly to its own throat. The long, spindly fingers dug into the space where a larynx would be. The entity's whole frame shuddered with a silent, violent tension. It mimicked, with grotesque exaggeration, the act of being choked. Its hollow torso seemed to cave in, its shoulders hitched, and its head tilted back in a pantomime of agony. It was a clear, horrifying message. Suffocation. Strangulation. She is cutting off your air. And then came the sound. It was the first and only sound he had ever heard it make. It wasn't a voice. It was a low, guttural rattle, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or the shake of a pebble in a dying man's throat. The sound seemed to emanate not from a mouth, but from the very core of its being, a vibration of pure despair that bypassed his ears and resonated deep inside his bones. It was the sound of a warning given by a throat that had been destroyed long ago. The combined effect, the pointing finger, the gruesome choking gesture, the death rattle, sent a new, more intellectual kind of fear through Leo. This wasn't just a monster trying to scare him. This was an attempt to communicate a specific danger. The thought was so insane that he immediately tried to discard it, but it had taken root. This new nightly horror began to bleed into his days, tinting everything with a layer of suspicion he couldn't seem to wipe away. He started watching Anya, really watching her, and he began to see things. They were small things, tiny fissures in the flawless facade, cracks so fine he was sure he was imagining them. They were talking in the kitchen one morning, the bright sun streaming through the window, when he asked her about the trip to Italy she'd once mentioned, the one she took with her family as a teenager. "Oh, we never went to Italy," she said, laughing as she poured him a coffee. "My father hated flying. We only ever drove, usually just up to the lake house." Leo froze, the mug halfway to his lips. He was certain she'd told him about seeing the Colosseum, about the taste of real gelato in a Roman piazza. He remembered the wistful look in her eye as she'd described it. He must have misremembered, or maybe she'd been talking about a trip she'd wanted to take. He shook his head, a small, frustrated gesture. "Right, sorry, must have mixed it up." "Don't worry," she said, her smile never faltering. "Your brain is soup right now. It's a miracle you remember your own name." Her casual dismissal should have been comforting, but it felt too smooth, too practiced. He started noticing other things. She had a small, intricate tattoo of a serpent on her wrist, and when he'd asked about it, she'd spun a charming story about getting it on a whim in New Orleans with a college roommate. Later, out of a paranoid curiosity he felt ashamed of, he tried to find the roommate on social media. Anya didn't have much of an online presence herself. She claimed to hate the vanity of it all, but surely a college friend would have tagged her in a photo. He found nothing. No tagged photos, no mentions, no trace of the wild girl from the New Orleans story. It was as if Anya's life had begun the day she met him. The most unsettling moments were fleeting, almost impossible to be sure of. They would be sitting in comfortable silence, and he would look up at her. For a split second, the warm, adoring light in her eyes would be gone, replaced by an expression of utter, profound emptiness. It was a cold, reptilian stillness, the ancient, unblinking gaze of a creature that feels nothing. It was there and then it was gone, vanished behind her usual loving smile before he could even fully register it. "What is it?" she'd ask, sensing his stare. "Nothing," he would lie, his heart suddenly beating a little too fast. "Just thinking how lucky I am." He'd feel like a traitor because part of him still believed it, but the fatigue was undeniable. It was a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could fix. It felt less like tiredness and more like a diminishment. His passions felt distant, his ambitions muted. The architectural projects that once excited him now felt like chores. It was as if the color was slowly being leached from his world, leaving everything in shades of gray. He was being drained, and as he lay in bed one night, waiting for the inevitable paralysis to strike, he couldn't escape the horrifying synchronicity of it all. The gaunt figure clawing at its throat, and his own slow, waking suffocation. The Leo who designed buildings was disappearing. He would sit at his drafting table, the expensive pencils feeling like foreign objects in his hand, and stare at a blank sheet of vellum, where once ideas had flowed, a torrent of angles, forms, and elegant solutions. There was now a silent, barren desert. The creative spark, the very engine of his identity, had sputtered and died. His portfolio was full of bold, ambitious designs, structures that reached for the sky. Now all he could summon was a profound sense of emptiness. He was an architect who could no longer build. This hollowing out was not confined to his work. It was in every corner of his life. Music he once loved now felt like meaningless noise. Jokes he would have laughed at earned only a tired, fleeting smile. He felt a growing detachment from himself, as if he were watching his own life from a great distance, a listless and uninspired spectator. The only emotion that remained in high fidelity was fear. The nightly terror was a splash of ice water on his soul, a horrifying jolt that reminded him he was still capable of feeling something. Anya, for her part, seemed to treat his decline as a positive development. "It's good for you, you know," she said one evening, running her fingers through his hair as he sat limply on the sofa. "You were always so tense, so driven. It's nice to see you finally. Relaxed. That's what she called it. He felt about as relaxed as a man being slowly anesthetized against his will. Every time she praised his newfound calmness, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. She wasn't just observing his decay, she was celebrating it. She was the placid, smiling gardener, tending to a plant she was systematically poisoning. The change in the nightly performance confirmed his deepest, most unspeakable fear. It happened on a Tuesday. The paralysis hit him like a physical blow, and the gaunt figure emerged from the shadows, its presence more oppressive than ever. It performed its grim ritual, the turn of the head, the pointing finger, the grotesque pantomime of suffocation. Leo watched with a kind of resigned dread. He knew the script, but tonight there was a new act. After clawing at its throat, the entity let its hands fall. It stood for a moment, utterly still, seemingly gathering its resolve. Then it took a step forward. It had never moved from its corner before. The single, silent step was a seismic event, shattering the established rules of the nightmare. It was closer now, standing directly beside Leo's side of the bed, looming over him. Leo's mind dissolved into pure, white-hot panic. It was going to touch him. After all these years, the final boundary was about to be crossed, but it didn't touch him. Instead, its long, shadowy hand hovered over his chest. The air grew intensely cold, and Leo felt a bizarre, internal pulling sensation, like a subtle yet powerful magnetic force drawing something out of him. The gaunt figure's fingers curled slowly, as if grasping an invisible rope of energy. With a great shuddering effort, it began to pull. Leo felt it. He felt a profound, unambiguous sense of loss, a spiritual exsanguination. It was a sensation of being hollowed out from the inside, his vitality, his ambition, his very essence being drawn out of his chest in a shimmering, unseen stream. He was a well, and he was being drained to the last muddy drop. The entity's form seemed to vibrate with the effort. It drew the invisible substance from him, its hand retracting slowly, carefully, as if carrying something precious and volatile. Then it turned its body with that same unnatural, deliberate slowness. It faced Anya's sleeping form. It extended its hand, the one that held his stolen essence, over her. It tilted its palm downward, and with a gentle opening gesture, it let go. It mimed the act of sprinkling something over her, of feeding her the very life force it had just harvested from him. The image was a cataclysm. It was the keystone that locked all the other terrifying pieces into place. His fatigue, her strange satisfaction in his decline, the entity's desperate warnings. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a diagnosis. The gaunt figure held its empty hand over Anya for a moment longer, and then it retreated, stepping back into the corner, its work for the night complete. It had delivered its message, a piece of theater so horrific and explicit it could not be misunderstood. When the paralysis finally broke, Leo didn't bolt upright. He couldn't. He lay there, utterly spent, a profound and terrifying emptiness echoing in his chest. He felt like a husk. He took a breath, and it felt thin, unsatisfying, as if the air itself had less oxygen than it used to. He was weaker. He was less. He slowly turned his head on the pillow. Anya was sleeping soundly, a faint, serene smile on her lips. She looked radiant, her skin glowing in the pale moonlight. She looked healthier than ever. She looked well-fed. Isolation was a cold, smooth wall pressing in from all sides. Leo felt untethered from reality, adrift in a sea of terrifying possibilities. The nightly visitations had become his only reliable compass point, a horrifying true north. in a world that no longer made sense. He was losing his grip. He needed an anchor. He needed Mark. Mark was a structural engineer. His world was even more rigid and unforgiving than Leo's. He dealt in concrete steel and the irrefutable laws of tensile strength. He was a man who believed in observable phenomena and peer-reviewed data. He was the most rational person Leo knew, and that was precisely why Leo had to talk to him. If he couldn't convince Mark, it meant he was truly going insane. If he could, it meant the world was. He wasn't sure which outcome was worse. They met at a dimly lit bar, the kind of place with dark wood and the smell of stale beer, a place where secrets felt safe. Leo hadn't been able to bring himself to talk in his own apartment, not with the risk of Anya overhearing. The thought of her knowing his suspicions filled him with a fear that was entirely separate from the nightly terror. Mark slid into the booth, his face etched with concern. "You look like hell, man," he said, his voice devoid of judgment. "Seriously, what's going on?" Leo took a long pull from his beer, the cold liquid doing nothing to calm the frantic hummingbird in his chest. "It's the sleep paralysis," he started, his voice low and raspy. "It's back. Every night," Mark nodded sympathetically. "Damn, I'm sorry to hear that. I thought that was behind you. Is it the new place? Stress from work?" "No," Leo said, shaking his head. "It's different now. He's different. He..." Mark's eyebrow arched. "You're calling it he now?" "The figure. The man in the corner," Leo clarified, realizing how he must sound. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tight on the table to keep them from shaking. "Mark, it's not just standing there anymore. It's trying to tell me something." He recounted the whole nightmare, the words spilling out of him in a desperate, jumbled torrent. He told Mark about the figure turning its head to look at Anya, about the long, skeletal finger pointing at her, about the grotesque pantomime of suffocation and the dry, rattling sound. Mark listened intently, his expression shifting from concern to a kind of clinical analysis. When Leo got to the final, most damning vision, the pulling of his essence, the feeding of Anya, he saw the last bit of belief drain from his friend's face. "Leo," Mark said gently after a long silence. He chose his words with the care of an engineer defusing a bomb. "Listen to what you're saying. Dream monster, a hallucination you've had for years, is suddenly playing a game of charades to warn you about your girlfriend. It's not a dream, it's real, I feel it. It's a neurological event," Mark countered, his voice firm but kind. "We've talked about this. It's your brain waking up before your body does. It's terrifying, but it's a trick, a chemical imbalance. So how do you explain me feeling like this?" Leo demanded, his voice cracking. "I can't work. I can't think. I feel like I'm being hollowed out, Mark. And she seems happier the worse I get. Of course you feel like that," Mark said, leaning forward, his earnestness palpable. "You're not sleeping. You're experiencing profound, prolonged sleep deprivation. That alone causes fatigue, depression, creative blocks, paranoia. Everything you're describing is a textbook symptom." He took a breath. "And look, I'm not a psychologist, but this all started up again when you met Anya, right? You're in your first truly serious relationship in years. That's a massive life change. It's stressful. It's not crazy to think your subconscious is working through some heavy stuff. Maybe you're scared of the commitment, scared of losing yourself in the relationship. So your brain creates this insane narrative where she's literally draining you, because that's what it feels like to you." Every rational word was a nail in Leo's coffin. He could hear it, the clean, simple logic. It was the exact argument he had tried to sell himself for weeks. But hearing it from the outside, from his best friend, felt like a profound betrayal. He wasn't being heard. He was being diagnosed. "So you think I'm crazy," Leo said flatly. The hope he had brought with him to the bar curdled into bitter disappointment. "No," Mark insisted, his frustration evident. "I think you're exhausted and scared, and your mind is playing its old tricks on you in a new way. I think you need to see a doctor, Leo, a sleep specialist, a therapist, someone who can help you manage the paralysis and the anxiety that's fueling it." Blaming Anya, that's not the answer. Leo stared down at his beer, at the condensation tracing a wet ring on the dark wood. He had come here seeking an ally and had found an intervention. Mark's logic was a fortress, impenetrable and absolute. There was no room in his world of concrete and steel for shadow creatures and soul eaters. He felt the wall of isolation become a solid, seamless prison. He was utterly, completely alone with his monster and his fear. "Yeah," Leo said, his voice hollow. He pushed his chair back and stood up, leaving his half-finished beer on the table. "Maybe you're right." He walked out of the bar and into the cold night air, leaving his last anchor to the rational world behind him. Returning to the apartment after the meeting with Mark was like willingly stepping into a beautifully decorated cage. The air, once filled with the scent of rosemary and contentment, now felt heavy and stagnant, thick with unspoken fears. Leo found himself watching Anya constantly, his gaze tracing her movements as she drifted through their home. He was a detective in his own life, searching for clues in the cadence of her speech, the curve of her smile, the depths of her eyes. He was looking for the monster, and the effort was exhausting. She, in turn, smothered him with a cloying, suffocating care. She would ask how he was feeling a dozen times a day, her brow furrowed with the perfect amount of concern. She would bring him blankets he didn't need and cups of tea he didn't want. Her solicitude felt less like affection and more like surveillance. She was a warden, and her kindness was the bars of his cell. The break came on a Saturday afternoon, bathed in the deceptive warmth of the autumn sun. Leo was sitting at his desk staring at a blank blueprint when he heard the sharp, sickening crack of ceramic shattering on the hardwood floor. He whipped around. Anya stood by the bookshelf, her hand frozen in midair. On the floor around her feet lay the fragmented remains of a small porcelain bluebird. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't valuable, not in terms of money. It was a small, delicate thing his grandmother had given him on his 10th birthday. A tangible piece of a past that felt increasingly distant and dreamlike. It was one of the few things he owned that connected him to a time before the fatigue, before the fear, before Anya. "Oh, Leo," she gasped, bringing her hands to her mouth. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. I was just dusting and I barely even touched it." He got up slowly, his legs feeling heavy. He knelt and looked at the pieces. The bird's head was sheared clean off, its tiny body split in two. It was irreparable. "It's okay," he said, the words tasting like ash. "It was an accident." "No, it's not okay," she insisted, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine distress. "I know how much it meant to you. I'm so clumsy, so stupid." He looked up at her, ready to offer a reassurance he didn't feel, and that's when he saw it. For the briefest fraction of a second, before her face crumpled into a mask of theatrical remorse, her expression was something else entirely. It was a flash of pure, unadulterated annoyance, a cold, flat reptilian impatience. It was the look of a person swatting away a fly, a momentary irritation at a minor obstacle. It held a chilling contempt for his sentimentality, for his connection to this fragile, worthless object. The look was there for no longer than a heartbeat, an infinitesimal flicker in her dark eyes. Then it was gone, seamlessly replaced by a flood of tears and apologies as she knelt beside him, making a show of trying to gather the tiny broken pieces. But he had seen it. He knew, with an unshakable certainty that went deeper than logic, that he had not imagined it. It was the first piece of tangible waking evidence he had. A crack in the porcelain doll, revealing the cold, hollow darkness within. That night, the anticipation of the paralysis was different. It was not just dread, but a strange, grim eagerness. He needed to see the figure. He needed his witness, his silent, terrifying collaborator. When the paralysis came, it was violent and immediate. The gaunt figure was already there, not in the corner, but in the center of the room, its form seeming to vibrate with a furious, kinetic energy. It was agitated, enraged. It raised both its hands and slammed them again and again against the invisible wall that separated its reality from his. There was no sound, but Leo felt the impacts as a series of concussive shudders in his chest. This was not the cold, detached messenger of previous nights. This was a being consumed by a silent, impotent fury. It was screaming at him, its rage a palpable force in the room. After a long, violent display, it stopped. It stood, its form heaving as if catching its breath. Then its frantic energy became focused. It raised its spindly finger and pointed, not at Anya this time, but at the empty space on the bookshelf where the bluebird had once sat. The gesture was sharp, accusatory. Then the finger snapped towards Anya, who slept on, oblivious. And then it did something new. Its long, skeletal fingers began to move in the air between them. The movements were complex, delicate, and utterly horrifying. The shadowy digits danced and wove, tracing intricate, invisible patterns. It took Leo a moment to understand, and when he did, a new layer of ice formed around his heart. It was mimicking a spider, patiently, meticulously weaving its web. The metaphor clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The broken bird wasn't an accident. It was a calculated act. She was severing his connections one by one. She had isolated him from Mark, turning his friend's concern into a wall between them. She had drained his passion for his work, cutting him off from his own identity. And now she had physically destroyed a link to his past, to his family. She was weaving a web around him, and he was the fly, already caught, growing weaker with every struggle. He wasn't just being fed upon, he was being trapped, encased, prepared. The spiderweb metaphor had rewired Leo's mind. The listless, passive victim was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. Fear was still a constant companion, a cold stone in the pit of his stomach, but it had a new edge. Purpose. He was no longer just a man haunted by a nightmare. He was a prisoner planning his escape, and the first rule of escape is to study your captor. He began to operate in a state of meticulous, high-stakes duplicity. To Anya, he was the same fading man, growing ever more placid and distant. He played the part of the empty shell she was creating, nodding vaguely at her conversation, allowing her to manage his life with her gentle, suffocating efficiency. But the moment she left the apartment, the fog would lift, replaced by a frantic, crystalline clarity. Her absence was his oxygen. His first target was her digital life, or lack thereof. He went beyond social media, diving into the deeper architecture of the internet. He searched public records, university alumni databases, professional networks, and credit history archives. He searched for Anya's full name. A name she had told him with a loving smile was Anya Petrova. The result was a deafening digital silence. There were other Anya Petrovas in the world, of course, but none matched her age, her history, or the scant details she had offered. The woman he lived with, the woman he had loved, did not officially exist. She was a ghost in the machine. He almost gave in to despair, but the image of the weaving spider pushed him forward. A spider doesn't just appear, it comes from somewhere. He shifted his strategy. He couldn't search for her, so he would search for her story. He focused on the one concrete detail she had given him that he could verify: the name of the small, forgettable town in upstate New York she claimed to be from. A place called Northwood Creek. She'd said she left about 10 years ago to find herself in the city. He started digging through the digital archives of the Northwood Creek Chronicle, a local paper with a rudimentary website. He searched for her name first. Nothing. Then he started searching for keywords, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He searched for crime reports, accidents, anything unusual around the time she would have left. For hours, he found nothing but announcements for county fairs and high school football scores. Just as he was about to give up, he changed his search terms one last time, typing in the most honest words he could think of: mysterious illness. A single result popped up. An article from 12 years ago. The headline was mundane, lacking any real alarm. Local community voices concern over youth malaise. Leo clicked the link. The page loaded slowly, the text formatted in an ugly, outdated font. He read, and with every word, the blood in his veins turned to ice. The article, written by a local journalist, described a strange and troubling pattern that had emerged in Northwood Creek over a 2-year period. Several of the town's most promising young adults, people in their late teens and early 20s, had been struck by a mysterious, debilitating condition. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't a disease the town doctor could identify. The victims didn't die, they just stopped. One was a gifted musician who had earned a scholarship to Juilliard. He suddenly lost all interest in his instrument, abandoning it to take a menial job at a gas station. Another was a brilliant, aspiring writer who suddenly couldn't string a sentence together, claiming she had nothing left to say. An all-star athlete had quit the team, overcome by a profound and unshakable lethargy. The journalist used a phrase a local councilman had coined to describe it: a wasting sickness of the spirit. Leo's breath hitched. His own creative death, his soul-deep fatigue. It was all there, described in the plain, factual language of a small-town newspaper. He read on, his eyes scanning the page with frantic intensity. The article noted that the strange affliction had stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The cluster of cases had ended roughly 12 years ago, and there hadn't been a new one since. Then came the final paragraph. It was almost an afterthought, a piece of local color. The journalist mentioned that the period of the wasting sickness coincided with the residency of a charming and beautiful newcomer, a woman who had rented a small cottage on the edge of town. She was remembered for her vivacious personality, but had left town suddenly around the same time the last victim reported their symptoms. The article didn't name her. It didn't need to. Leo pushed his chair back from the desk, a choked, guttural sound escaping his throat. It was her. It had to be. She had been in that town, a beautiful, charming newcomer. She had stayed for a couple of years, and during that time, the town's brightest lights had been systematically extinguished. Then she had moved on. He wasn't going crazy. He wasn't the first. He was just the latest in a long, invisible line of victims. Another dried-out husk she would eventually discard when she was finished. He was prey, and he had the predator's hunting history staring back at him from the screen. He sat there for a long time, the words on the screen glowing in the darkening room, the truth a cold, heavy weight in his chest. Then he heard it, the distinct metallic click of a key turning in the apartment door's lock. Anya was home. With a surge of adrenaline, Leo frantically closed the browser window, cleared his history and shut down the computer. He spun his chair around just as the door swung open, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Anya stepped inside, silhouetted against the light from the hallway. She smiled at him, a warm, radiant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sitting in the dark, my love?" she asked, her voice like honey. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The knowledge changed the very air in the apartment. It was no longer a home. It was a hunting ground, and the roles of predator and prey had become terrifyingly blurred. Leo was a spy, living behind enemy lines, every word a performance, every gesture a calculated deception. He maintained his mask of languid indifference, a convincing portrait of a man fading away. Inside, however, a cold, vigilant fire was burning. He was watching her, and he felt with a prickling certainty that she was watching him back, sensing a new, taut wire of tension underneath his carefully constructed apathy. He needed physical proof. The newspaper article was a ghost story, a pattern seen from a distance. He needed something tangible, something he could hold in his hand that would prove her long and monstrous history. He needed to search her things. The opportunity came on a Thursday. Anya announced she was meeting a new friend from her yoga class for a long lunch and a trip to a gallery. "I feel bad leaving you," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she adjusted her scarf in the mirror. "But I think it's good for me to get out." "You just rest, my love." The moment the door clicked shut behind her, Leo was in motion. The ticking clock of her absence was a frantic beat in his ears. He started in their bedroom, the heart of her territory. Her closet was neat, organized. The clothes were stylish but generic, with no history to them, as if they had been purchased all at once to furnish a new identity. Her dresser drawers were the same, perfectly folded sweaters, clean and impersonal. He felt a pang of despair. Of course she wouldn't keep anything incriminating. She was too smart, too careful. He was about to give up when his eyes landed on a large, old-fashioned suitcase tucked away on the top shelf of the closet, coated in a thin layer of dust. It was out of place amongst the newness of everything else. He pulled a chair over, his muscles straining as he wrestled the heavy case down. It was unlocked. He laid it on the bed and opened it. It was mostly empty, save for a few moth-eaten winter coats. It was the smell that caught his attention, a faint, musty scent of cedar and something else, something old and faintly metallic. His heart hammering, he ran his hands along the fabric lining of the case. Near the bottom corner, his fingers brushed against a hard, rectangular shape, a false bottom. His hands trembled as he worked at the edge of the lining, finally pulling it free. Beneath it was a small, recessed compartment, and inside, nestled in the dark, was a small, antique silver box tarnished with age. It was no bigger than his palm, intricately engraved with a pattern of swirling vines. He lifted it out. It was heavy, solid. It felt ancient. With a deep, steadying breath, he opened it. The contents were not what he expected. Not jewelry. Not letters. It was a small, curated collection of mundane objects, a museum of stolen lives. His eyes took them in one by one. A single silver cufflink, its face engraved with the letter R, a perfectly preserved edelweiss, the white flower browned with age, a heavy brass button, the kind from a military-style greatcoat, child's milk tooth, small and pearly white, and at the bottom, coiled like a sleeping snake, was a thick lock of silver-gray hair, tied with a faded velvet ribbon. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He sank down on the edge of the bed, the open box in his hands. These were not keepsakes. They were trophies. Each object was a life. The ambitious professional, the hopeful romantic, the stoic traveler, the innocent child, the wise elder, all of them hollowed out and consumed, their essence reduced to a single, pathetic token in a predator's trophy case. The Northwood Creek victims were not an anomaly. They were a chapter in a book that was centuries long. He carefully placed everything back, slid the box into its hiding place, and fixed the lining. He heaved the suitcase back onto the top shelf just as he heard his phone buzz. A text from Anya, thinking of you. Be home in an hour. That night, the paralysis felt different. Leo did not fight it. He sank into it, his mind clear and cold, waiting. The gaunt figure appeared, and for the first time, Leo looked at it not with terror, but with a sense of grim expectation. The entity began its ritual, but its movements seemed more perfunctory tonight. The pointing, the choking, it was an old message already received. Leo waited, focusing his thoughts, his entire being on the silver box hidden in the suitcase. Show me, he thought, a desperate, silent plea. Confirm it, please. As if it had heard him, the gaunt figure stopped. It stood motionless for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it raised its arm. But it did not point at Anya. It pointed directly at the closet door. It held the pose, its shadowy finger aimed at the exact spot on the high shelf where the suitcase was hidden. Leo's breath caught. His silent plea had been answered. Then the entity did something it had never done before. It lowered its arm and turned its faceless head back to Leo, and with a movement that was clear, human, and utterly unambiguous, it nodded its head. A single, slow, definitive nod. Yes, the last shred of Leo's doubt dissolved into the shadows. This creature was not a hallucination. It was not a product of his subconscious. It was a witness, an ally. And it had just confirmed that the monster in his bed was real. Her crimes were real. And the evidence was hidden in the dark. The nod changed everything. The gaunt figure was no longer a subject of Leo's terror, but the object of his intense, morbid fascination. An alliance had been forged in the silent crucible of his nightly paralysis. He would lie in bed waiting for sleep, not with the panicked dread of prey, but with the grim focus of a soldier waiting for a briefing from his only commander. He knew what Anya was, and he had the physical proof locked away in her suitcase. But a final, crucial question remained. What was the gaunt figure, and why was it his reluctant savior? He spent his days in a state of heightened awareness, the world seeming both sharper and more unreal. He pieced together the fragments of his knowledge, connecting the trophies in the silver box to the story of the wasting sickness in Northwood Creek. Each trophy was a life, a soul she had siphoned off and discarded. The cufflink, the flower, the tooth, they were the tombstones of her victims. He was meant to be the next exhibit in her macabre collection. The answer to his final question came 2 nights after he found the box. The paralysis descended, and it was different this time. It was heavier, deeper, a pressure that seemed to exist not just on his body, but on his very consciousness. It felt like being pulled down into the abyssal depths of the ocean. The gaunt figure stood over him, its form clearer and more solid than ever before, as if his newfound knowledge had given it substance. There was no pointing tonight, no miming of suffocation or feeding. The entity's warnings were no longer necessary. It stood over him, a silent, skeletal judge. And then it did something that sent a shockwave of pure energy through Leo's paralyzed form. It raised a hand, not to warn, but to explain. It touched its own hollow chest with its long, shadowy fingers. Then it slowly extended that same hand and pointed it directly at Leo. The moment its finger aligned with him, the world dissolved. It was not a sight or a sound, but a direct, brutal transfer of information. A torrent of memory and sensation pouring directly into his mind. He was no longer Leo, lying paralyzed in his 21st century bedroom. He was someone else. He feels the biting wind on his face, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. He is standing in the muddy lane of a village centuries old. The buildings around him made of dark timber and crumbling stone. A woman approaches and his heart, a heart that is not his own, leaps in his chest. It is Anya. Her face is identical, framed by a simple linen coif. Her dress coarse and archaic, but the eyes are the same. The smile is the same. She is a miracle of light and beauty in this grim gray world. He feels the heady intoxication of her charm, the way she makes him feel like the only man in the world. He is a poet, a dreamer, and she is his muse. She praises his words. She encourages his ambitions, and he feels his talent blossom in the warmth of her attention. Then, he feels the change. A slow, creeping lethargy. The words no longer come. The passion for his art turns to ash in his mouth. He feels a hollowing out, a spiritual anemia, and he watches in confusion as she seems to grow more radiant, more vibrant with each passing day. He is a candle, and she is basking in his diminishing flame. He grows thin, gaunt. He feels the final horrifying moments of his life. He is lying on a straw mattress too weak to move, his body a wasted skeletal frame. She is standing over him, her face not of a lover, but of a connoisseur savoring the last drop of a fine wine. There is no malice in her eyes, only a deep, ancient, and utterly indifferent hunger. He feels his last spark of life being drawn from him, a final, agonizing pull. And in that last moment, all that is left of him is a single, focused point of pure, incandescent rage. A rage so powerful, so absolute, it refuses to be extinguished. A rage that screams one silent, eternal vow. Never again. The vision shattered. Leo was back in his body. The pressure on his chest immense. A silent scream trapped in his lungs. He was staring up at the gaunt figure, and he understood. He was looking at a ghost. The creature before him was the spectral echo of that long-dead poet. The first victim he had now witnessed, or perhaps just one of many whose rage was strong enough to endure. Its horrifying appearance was a self-portrait of its own death. Gaunt, hollowed out, a being of pure shadow because its substance had been stolen. It was tethered to its murderer, its undying rage forging a psychic link that allowed it to manifest whenever she began to feed. It wasn't a demon trying to warn him. It was a fellow victim, screaming a silent, centuries-old alarm. Its terrifying presence was not a threat. It was an echo of the horror she had inflicted upon it. The only language it had left. Leo lay there, his mind reeling with the terrible, tragic clarity of it all. He now understood the full scope of the battle he was in. He wasn't just fighting for his own life. He was fighting for the memory of the poet, for the owner of the cufflink, for the child who lost a tooth, for every soul she had consumed throughout her impossibly long existence. The fear was still there, but it had been transmuted into something hard and cold. Resolve. The time for investigation was over. The time for being a victim was over. A confrontation was coming. He was no longer just trying to escape the web. He was going to burn it to the ground. The decision to act settled in Leo's soul like a layer of permafrost. The time for fear, for doubt, for investigation was over. He was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. He was a man sharpening it. He moved through the days with a quiet, chilling deliberation that was a universe away from the listless apathy he had been feigning. He was a tightly coiled spring, and the tension was palpable. Anya noticed the change immediately. She was a predator, and the scent of rebellion in her prey was a scent she knew well. Her casual affection became sharper, her questions more pointed. The mask of the perfect girlfriend was still there, but it had grown thin, and her ancient predatory eyes were clearly visible behind it. The apartment became a silent battleground. Every shared meal, every brief conversation, a tense negotiation over a chasm of unspoken knowledge. Leo knew he couldn't run. A creature like her wouldn't be so easily escaped. Nor could he fight her physically. That would be like a mouse trying to fist fight a python. The confrontation had to be here, in this cage she had built for him. It had to be on his terms. He waited until evening. He watched her prepare dinner, her movements still graceful, but now imbued with a terrifying menace. He waited until she was arranging flowers in a vase, her back to him. With his heart hammering a brutal rhythm against his ribs, he walked to the bedroom. He retrieved the old suitcase, opened the false bottom, and took out the antique silver box. He walked back into the living room. The box felt cold and heavy in his hand, a small silver coffin full of dead lives. He placed it on the center of the dark wood coffee table. The soft click of the metal on the wood was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. Anya went still. Her hands froze around the stem of a lily. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, with the deliberate, fluid motion of a snake, she turned around. Her eyes went from his face to the box on the table and back to his face. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The warm, loving woman he knew as Anya vanished as if she had never existed. The soft lines of her face hardened, the light in her eyes extinguished, replaced by a flat, black reptilian emptiness that held the cold of centuries. Her posture shifted, her relaxed stance snapping into one of perfect predatory stillness. The mask didn't just slip, it evaporated, revealing the ancient primordial thing that had been wearing it. "So," she said. Her voice was the biggest change of all. The warm melodic tone was gone, replaced by a low, resonant voice that was utterly devoid of emotion. It was the sound of stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. The mouse has learned to gnaw at the walls of its cage. "I was wondering when you would." There was no denial. No questions. Only a profound ancient arrogance. "Who was he?" Leo asked, his own voice sounding thin and weak in comparison. He pointed a trembling finger at the box, the one with the cufflink. "Was he an architect too?" A flicker of something, annoyance. Boredom passed through her eyes. "He was a banker," she said dismissively, "full of tedious ambition. Very nourishing but utterly uninteresting. Just like the poet who couldn't stop whining, and the soldier who thought he was unbreakable. They are all the same in the end. Little candles so desperate to burn brightly, so easy to snuff out." The casual cruelty of it, the utter lack of remorse, stole the air from Leo's lungs. He was not talking to a person. He was talking to a force of nature, a hurricane discussing the houses it had leveled. "You're a monster," he whispered. "I am a survivor," she corrected him, her voice cold and precise. "I am what you are, just more honest about the process. You consume resources to live. You eat, you build, you burn. My resources, more refined. It is potential. It is passion. It is the vibrant spark that makes little creatures like you feel important. And when you are drained of it, you become quiet. It's a mercy, really." She took a step towards him and he flinched. A thin, cruel smile touched her lips. "What gave me away?" "The nightly theatrics? My weeping friend is always so dramatic. He clings so desperately." "He's not your friend," Leo said, finding a sliver of strength. "He's your prisoner, just like the rest of us." "Details," she sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "The point is, the game is over. And you have been a very, very disappointing meal." As she spoke, Leo felt a new and terrifying sensation. It was her power, but raw, unfiltered. A wave of crushing psychic pressure washed over him, a force of pure entropy and despair. It was the draining, but 100 times more powerful, a direct and malicious assault. The fatigue he had been fighting for months slammed into him like a physical blow. The colors in the room began to fade. The edges of his vision grayed. His newfound resolve felt like a sandcastle against a tsunami. He felt his will to fight, his will to live being systematically dismantled. He staggered back, one hand on the wall for support, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She watched him, her expression one of clinical curiosity, a scientist observing a specimen's final moments. "Don't fight it," she said, her voice a soothing, venomous whisper in his mind. "It's so much easier to just let go. Just fade. Become quiet." He was losing. He was being unmade. As his consciousness began to fray, his eyes darted to the corner of the room, the place where his phantom ally always appeared. The shadows there were deep, but they were just shadows. He was alone. The gaunt figure was not coming. Leo was drowning. Her power was a cold, black ocean, and he was sinking into its depths. The memories that made him him. The scent of his grandmother's kitchen. The pride of his first completed blueprint. The exact shade of the sky on a perfect autumn afternoon were dissolving, becoming distant and unimportant. In their place was a vast gray quietude, a seductive emptiness that promised an end to all struggle. It was the peace of the void, and it was calling to him. His knees buckled. He slid down the wall, his muscles refusing his commands. Anya watched his descent with the detached air of a scientist, a faint predatory smile on her lips. "So much easier this way," she whispered, the words echoing in the silent, dying landscape of his mind. Just let go, he was about to. The fight had left him. The last ember of his will was about to be extinguished. And then he felt it. A new pressure. A familiar, terrifying weight. It was the paralysis. It was seizing him even as he was awake. A crushing physical force layering itself over the psychic assault. But this time it felt different. It was not part of her attack. It was an anchor. A brutal, horrifying anchor holding him to the world, refusing to let him drift away. His eyes, wide with a terror that cut through the encroaching apathy, darted to the corner of the room. The shadows there began to deepen, to churn, to coalesce. From the darkness, a form emerged. A tall, skeletal figure of absolute black. A wound in the fabric of reality. The gaunt figure had arrived. It was not a dream. It was here. Anya saw it too. Her head snapped toward the corner, and a hiss of pure, undiluted venom escaped her lips. "Always," she spat, her voice tight with ancient fury. "You are a persistent, sentimental ghost." The figure ignored her. Its faceless gaze was fixed on Leo. It raised its long, skeletal arm, and for the first time Leo felt not fear, but a flicker of desperate hope. The entity reached out, its shadowy fingers extending towards him. It did not touch him, but he felt a connection snap into place. And then came the rage. It was not his own. It was a cold, pure, ancient fury. A glacier of hatred and injustice that had been compressed over centuries. It was the poet's rage at his stolen words, the soldier's rage at his broken strength, the lover's rage at his betrayed heart. It was the combined anguish of every soul she had ever consumed, and it poured into him, a torrent of icy, strengthening fire. It was agony, but it was life. It burned away the gray emptiness, cauterized his psychic wounds, and gave him a terrible, borrowed strength. He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling with the sheer force of the energy flowing into him. He was no longer just Leo. He was an avatar of her victims. He was their vengeance. The gaunt figure's arm moved, its finger pointing, no longer in warning, but in command. It did not point at Anya. It pointed at the coffee table, at the small silver box, the weapon. Anya saw the gesture and her eyes widened in genuine alarm. "No," she shrieked, her composure finally shattering. She lunged for the box, but Leo was faster. Fueled by the ghost's fury, he launched himself across the room, diving for the table. He snatched the box just as her fingers grazed his arm. Her touch was ice, a jolt of pure draining power, but the rage inside him was hotter. He scrambled back, clutching the box to his chest. It felt like holding a block of frozen poison. "You are nothing," Anya screamed, her voice losing its cold composure and becoming a raw, feral sound. "You are cattle. Give that back." She gathered her power for another assault. The lights in the apartment flickered and died, plunging the room into a deep twilight, lit only by the streetlights outside. The air grew frigged, but Leo knew what he had to do. He turned and hurled the silver box with all his might against the hard brick of the fireplace. The sound of the impact was dull, but the result was spectacular. The antique silver shattered like glass. It did not merely break, it seemed to explode, a small, violent supernova of dark energy. The trophies, the cufflink, the flower, the tooth, the lock of hair were flung across the room, scattering into the shadows. Anya screamed. It was a sound of true and profound agony. A sound that had nothing to do with the physical world. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart, of a foundation being obliterated. Her connection to her power, her anchor to the lives she had stolen, was severed. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The beautiful, radiant woman began to wither before his eyes. It was like watching a time-lapse film of a flower decaying in seconds. Her skin, once glowing, turned sallow and stretched tight across her bones. Her dark, lustrous hair thinned and grayed, falling out in clumps. Her body, once vibrant and strong, stooped and curled in on itself, becoming frail, ancient, and brittle. The glamour she had worn for centuries, woven from stolen life, had been torn away, revealing the impossibly ancient, withered husk beneath. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored what he had felt for months. She opened her mouth, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. She was a hollow thing now, a forgotten relic. With a final shuddering sigh, her form dissolved, not into dust, but into a fine gray ash that drifted for a moment in the air, before vanishing completely. She was gone. Leo stood in the center of the silent, dark room, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. He was exhausted, scoured, and utterly, completely empty. But he was alive, and he was free. He looked to the corner. The gaunt figure was still there, a silent, unmoving column of shadow. Its rage had subsided, leaving only a profound, centuries-old weariness. Its duty was almost done. Silence descended. It was a new kind of silence, not the heavy, listening quiet of the predator, but a vast, clean emptiness. The apartment was a wreck, a still life of their final, desperate battle. Shards of the shattered silver box glinted in the moonlight like fallen stars. On the floor, scattered in the shadows, lay the mundane tokens of stolen lives. A cufflink, a dried flower, a single brass button. Leo stood in the middle of it all, a hollowed-out man on the shore of a nightmare that had finally receded. The borrowed rage had seeped out of him, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that was more profound than any fatigue he had ever known. He was an empty vessel, scoured clean by terror and fury. But he was whole. He was his own. His gaze drifted to the corner of the room. The gaunt figure was still there. Its form seemed softer now. The sharp, terrifying edges blurred. The rage that had defined it, that had held it together for centuries, was gone. All that remained was a quiet, weary presence, a ghost whose long war was finally over. It was no longer a sentinel of dread, but a silent witness to a shared victory. Leo drew a ragged breath. The air felt light and clean in his lungs for the first time in months. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking in the stillness. It was the first time he had ever spoken to it. The gaunt figure did not reply, but he felt an answer. A wave of ancient, weary gratitude flowed from it, a final, silent communication. It turned its faceless head toward him, and with a slow, almost reverent grace, it gave a single, final nod. It was not a nod of confirmation or warning. It was a nod of farewell, a nod of peace, and then it began to fade. It did not vanish in a blink. It dissolved, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a gentle breeze. The absolute black of its being softened to gray, then to a translucent silver, until all that was left was the empty corner of the room, the moonlight, and the quiet. The poet's ghost, after centuries of rage and torment, was finally, truly at rest. Leo did not sleep that night. He sat on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the dawn. As the first pale fingers of gray and rose light stretched across the sky, he felt the last of the oppressive atmosphere in the apartment dissipate. It was as if a window had been thrown open after a century of being sealed shut, letting out the stale air of fear and decay. The road back would be long. He knew that. He was a ruin of a man, and he would have to rebuild himself brick by brick. He would have to find his passion for his work again, reconnect with a friend who thought he was insane, and learn to live with the impossible. Terrifying knowledge of the world that existed just beneath the surface of this one. Later that morning, with the sun shining brightly, he found a small cardboard box. He walked through the apartment, and one by one, he picked up the trophies from the floor. He held each one in his palm for a moment. The cufflink, the button, the brittle flower, the child's tooth, the lock of silver hair. They were no longer objects of horror, but relics of lives lost. They were not trophies, but gravestones. He felt a profound, aching sadness for the people they represented, the silent chorus that had lent him their rage when he needed it most. He closed the box, sealed it with tape, and knew what he had to do. That afternoon, he drove out of the city to a place where a wide, fast-moving river cut through a forest. He stood on the bridge and opened the box one last time. He let the contents fall into the churning water below, watching until the current had carried them away. A final, humble burial for the forgotten victims. That night, for the first time in months, he felt a genuine, simple tiredness. He got into his own bed. The sheets were cool and clean. The apartment was quiet. He closed his eyes, expecting nothing, and then it came. A gentle, familiar weight, the soft, sinking pressure of sleep paralysis. His body was stone, his breath was shallow. He was awake but could not move. His eyes opened. He looked around the dark room. He saw the window, the dresser, the half-open closet door. He saw the corner where his phantom ally had stood watch for so long. It was empty. There was no presence, no listening silence, no sense of being watched by a malevolent force or a desperate friend. He was simply paralyzed. It was a clinical condition, a neurological quirk, a misfiring of his own brain. It was not a visitation. He was alone. A profound sense of peace washed over him. The silence was no longer a threat. It was a gift. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in an eternity, he let himself fall into a deep, dreamless, and healing sleep.